But our next lecture is on one of the most intriguing features of the Petra landscape, the Petra Garden and Pool Complex as visual propaganda. And our presenter is Dr. Leigh-Ann Bedal, who is Associate Professor in Anthropology at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Penn State Erie, the Barron College in Erie, Pennsylvania, where she teaches anthropology, archaeology, and ancient history courses. Her dissertation, The Petra Pool Complex, a Hellenistic Paradisos in the Nabatean capital, grew out of her own work, resulting from the Petra Lower Market survey and excavation. In addition to her extensive excavations in Jordan, she's worked at sites in Italy, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and even Southern California. Her research interests include an emphasis in the Iron Age to Classical and Byzantine periods and their urbanization. She especially is interested in the archaeology of power and garden archaeology. She's worked in museums in Philadelphia, San Francisco, Berkeley, Jerusalem, and in the process of her career so far, she received numerous research fellowships and grants, resulting in many awards and honors. In addition to her book on the Petra Pool Complex, which has gone into its second printing, she has some 30 journal articles and book chapters, many of them relating to her work at Petra. A frequent lecturer at professional societies and community groups, she's no stranger to California because her first degree in anthropology was from Cal State Northridge, where she graduated summa cum laude. So we welcome back to California, and we're pleased that she's agreed to speak to us today. Leigh-Ann Bedal.
It is nice to be back in California. I would have liked this to have been January or February, though, I have to say. It would have been a nice change. Okay, so yes, I'm going to be talking about the site, which is my favorite site, not at Dare, as the others have talked about, but my favorite site, which is the Petra Garden. And, okay, so what you see here on the left is the valley of Petra, the valley along the Wadi Musa, and you can see it in context with the Al-Khazna, the treasury that you've already been introduced to. And the thing I wanted you to look at, you look at that landscape, you see many pictures now, that desert landscape, and it should be pointed out that of the 25 most water-poor countries in the world, 16 of them are in the Middle East, and Jordan has been ranking like second or third, I've seen looking at the reports over the last, say, decade. So it is one of the most water-poor countries in the world. And also, just to give you some context here, that you need at more than 300 millimeters of rainfall a year in order to sustain agriculture for a substantial community, and that only about 14% of the mean annual rainfall is exploitable. And so one of the things that you realize is that in order to have any kind of settlement in an environment like this, in the desert regions of Jordan, is you can't rely on rainfall, you have to be able to exploit the springs and be able to bring water into any place that you are at. And be able to store, and Cindy Finlayson is going to be talking about some of those facilities up at Adair tomorrow. Now, so again, looking back at the environment here, this is the city center of Petra, and while it's really not known exactly how many people were living there, because there hasn't been as much enough, I would say, excavation of the residential area of Petra. There's been more focus on the monuments of Petra. But the estimate has been, we commonly hear like 30,000 people, but that really is just an estimate. But it is still a substantial population that was living there. And so when you know about the environment, the climate, this desert, this arid desert, the lack of rainfall or very minimal rainfall, then it should be noted that they have this very monumental garden and pool complex in the middle of the city. And so I've been working there since 1998, my first field season as a graduate student, discovering, as was said before, this was thought to have been a marketplace. One of the things that Petra has suffered from is that people who, prior to any excavation, there are people who labeled places in the city as markets and temples and gymnasiums, and then archaeologists come along and like, oh, nope, it's not what that is. And so then we have to start over. And so next door to the site, you can actually see it off on the left there, the so-called Great Temple is very likely not a temple at all, but was I argue, an audience hall, and the garden and the Great Temple, or this audience hall, part of a larger palace complex during the Nabatean time. Okay, so what is this garden and pool complex composed of? So one thing is that there is this giant pool. It measures 43 meters from east to west and 23 meters north to south. Just to give you context, that is about the size of a standard Olympic swimming pool. And at the center, there is an island. On the island, as you can see here from these 3D reconstructions, a pavilion sitting on top of this island. It's basically, that's what the island is. And it has doorways on all four sides, very broad doorways, so that anybody sitting inside that island would be able to look out across the surface of the water. And then, of course, if they're looking to the north, across the garden itself, and having great views of the garden. I imagine that this island was used for banqueting, right, for sitting and eating and drinking, of course, and then enjoying the garden. Now, the garden terrace to the north of the pool measures 53 by 65 meters. This is a bit smaller than an official football field, again, to give you some idea. And it was actually created, actually, I'm going to go back here for a second. Where the pool is, you can see that they cut out, the Nabateans quarried out the bedrock. And that stone would have been used for constructing other structures as they created this shelf in order to be able to lay out this pool. And then the debris from the construction, all the chips of stone, were thrown to the north, on the slope to the north, and leveled it out to create this big artificial terrace. Now, we do have archaeological evidence for pathways subdividing the garden and colonnades along them. We imagine them as having arbors, shaded arbors, for all of those walkways. And while we don't know exactly what was growing, all of the different plants that were growing in the garden, we do find fig seeds and grape seeds, olive seeds, we find walnut shells and such. We know that those are plants that are growing in the area that the Nabateans had. There's actually a giant grape vineyard to the north of Petra. But what we do know for sure was growing in the garden was we have these phytoliths that are microscopic silica found in the soils, and that tells us that there were palm trees, date palm trees. So I like to imagine a big, large grove of date palm trees occupying this terrace. Very shady environment for the terrace. Okay, so giant football field-sized garden, this giant Olympic pool-sized pool. Where did they get this water from? Now, we do have this one source from Strabo, a Greek historian, who talks about Petra, and as you can see, has within there are abundant springs of water, both for domestic purposes and for watering gardens. So there is a spring inside Petra. One spring here, to give you, let's see, here's that valley I showed you. So Petra city center is way down here. This is the Seek leading into it, and the modern Wadi Musa. So down here inside Petra is one spring, And it's a very small spring, and it's way down at the western end, at the lower elevations of the city. It would not have been able to provide the water for all of the city and for the areas in higher elevations. So what the Nabateans did is they exploited these springs here, Ain Musa, the spring of Moses, and Ain Brak, and they are about 3.5 and 5 kilometers to the east, and they brought the water from there. So this is showing the pathway of the aqueducts, built aqueducts, stone channels, and also some ceramic pipelines that were used to carry the water all the way down across very rugged terrain, bringing the water down a great deal of elevation. The measurement for this is over 21,000 meters of channels that were created for this water system just from these two springs. This is about 13.5 miles. So now one of those springs, the aqueduct from Ain Brak, ends right in the city center, and it ends right at the southeastern corner of the garden and pool complex. It is directly feeding that garden. And you can see here, what happens is the channel comes down. There is a reservoir built on the top of this cliff here. And then right in this corner, you can see from this aerial shot, is this cut apse. So it's almost like a chute that allows the water to drop down. It's very badly eroded on the It's very badly eroded here, but you can see down in the shadows here the original cut, and we actually have the chisel marks showing that it was cut in this way. And then around the pool, we have several pipelines that are ceramic, and it's kind of interesting to look at the ceramic pipelines because while the Nabateans certainly didn't invent the idea of ceramic pipes, those had been being used in the Mediterranean region for centuries, but what they did do that was new was to make their pipe segments on the wheel. So they were throwing them on the wheel like they did their beautiful fine ware pottery, and they were able to therefore make them very thin, right, and so very lightweight, and so it's actually a little bit more efficient in the way, also just sort of carrying them around and then being able to lay them to transport water all over Petra. And then there's also this aqueduct that carried water around the pool, all around the perimeter of the pool, and then it drops down into this tank in front of the island, where it then comes out in these channels. So it's distributed, it's called a castellum divisorium, so the water's divided and sent off into two different locations on the garden terrace. So it's quite an elaborate system here for the water. Okay, so now, what I wanted to talk about today was, so we can be very impressed by this garden, imagine what it looked like, look at the background, the desert environment, and think about how impressive this would be, not only for the Nabateans, but any visitors, and what is actually going on here? Why did they invest so much of their precious resources, this water, into something that is clearly not a practical functionary garden? It's not a kitchen garden, it's not a vegetable garden, it's not the pool is not just a reservoir, it's got this island in it. And so where I want to take us is, first of all, back in time, and then also a little bit to the east, to Mesopotamia. We're looking at the larger ancient Near East. And when we think of gardens of the ancient Near East, probably the first thing that comes to mind is the Garden of Eden, the biblical Garden of Eden, which of course has this symbolism of paradise, this ideal garden, and then also of innocence and purity that we know from the stories of Adam and Eve. But then there's also the garden in the ancient Near East that is very much associated with fertility. This is just one example of poetry from ancient Mesopotamia, the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. These are the fertility goddess and god into the Sumerians. And you can just see from things that they go into the garden, and Dumuzi is planting his sweet honey-covered seed, and then Inanna is pouring out grain and plants from her womb, right? So all of this is fertility, and then also, if you notice that Inanna, again, the goddess of fertility, she holds in her hand, very often we see her depicted holding a cluster of dates. And dates and grape clusters and pomegranates, these are all symbols of fertility and abundance in the Middle East. So, get an idea of these ideas of paradise and fertility and abundance. But now I'm going to talk about the Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrian kings, because they brought the garden to sort of a higher level. In the early part of the first millennium BC, we have King Ashurnasirpal II, who at his capital at Nimrud has this stele. It was erected, and there's an inscription on it. And one of the things he does is he talks about collecting seeds from the various lands that he travels to. And of course, traveling is also including conquering. And he's gathering them and bringing them back to his capital and creating a garden with those imported plants. And then he has to, and he goes through, his inscription is very long, and it gives the names of all the different types of trees that he grows. And he calls it the Garden of Delight, and he actually creates this canal of abundance, which he actually digs through the mountain to bring water from the Lesser Zab River. And of course, nearby is also the Zagros River. Here we're in the northern part of Mesopotamia, so rainfall, isn't as minimal as we have down in Jordan. So they have these large rivers that they can exploit for the water. But he also describes himself like a squirrel running around and planting the seeds. So he's putting himself into a position of being the gardener, sort of the source of this, or the controller of the fertility of the land. And then this just continues throughout the Neo-Assyrian period. About a century later, Sargon II, at his newly built capital, at Khorsabad, he now has what they start to use the term Kirimahu. Kirum is garden, and that's the term that Ashurnasirpal used, but now you have Kirimahu, and Kirimahu is this very specific term being used now for the pleasure garden of the palace. And this is a garden that is, like I said, very luxurious, and it always includes water, and then also these bitanu, which is this little sort of like a summer house gazebo type of thing, or a pergola that you would imagine in the garden. And then at Nineveh, the third of the Assyrian capitals, you have the successors to Sargon, who also brag in all of their inscriptions. They're bragging about creating these gardens attached to the palace, and they're bringing the trees and the animals of the conquered lands to the palace. So their garden is now, here we have lions being shown here, and the garden is now a metaphor for the empire itself, showing what the king controls. Here's a scene showing gardeners working on the palace garden. And then the very famous relief sculpture from Ashurbanipal's palace showing his garden. Just to note some of the things, you can see the aqueduct being built to bring water and irrigating the trees. This, by the way, is now believed by scholars to actually be a depiction of the hanging gardens of Nineveh, which later becomes remembered as actually Babylon. So if you hear of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, this is probably actually the Hanging Gardens at Nineveh. Okay. And here's Ashurbanipal. He's celebrating with his queen in his palace garden. And what are they doing here? They're actually celebrating a war victory. The head of the Elamite enemy is hanging from one of his trees. So we even get some of the association of the garden with that power of the king, and again, the empire in this time conquering the Elamites. Now, the tradition of gardens, these palace gardens, ends up spreading eastward into Persia. You have the paradisos, these palace, they're almost like hunting parks that are associated with the palace and the king. But I want to take us eastward because after Alexander the Great, who was brought up before, we have this blending of East and West cultures. And one of the things that happens there is that the Hellenistic kings, who are Greek, they start to take on many of the traditions of the East, and one of those is the idea of the palace garden. And then we see here in ancient Judea, in the late 2nd century BC, the Hasmonean rulers in Judea, they have their palace. This is their palace. They had multiple palaces at Jericho. Each king would build his next palace, and each palace would have gardens. And then now we have a new feature, though. Now we have the swimming pool. This had never existed before, at least not as far as I've been able to find anywhere. The swimming pool, and it is definitely a swimming pool. It's not a reflective pool. It's not a pool that's for serving water, like a reservoir. It is a swimming pool, and we actually have in Josephus, he talks about Herod the Great, who had all of these other horrible things about him, including the fact that he had his sort of competitor, the high priest Aristobulus III, he had him drowned in one of these pools of the Hasmonean palace. They were frolicking around, all these, his friends, and then he gave the signal, and there went Aristobulus III. So that tells us about the use of the pools for swimming and birding. And then Herod himself has his own palaces. Once he becomes king, he has his own palaces built, including at Jericho, where he also has these great gardens. Here's an aerial shot. You can see, sorry, I keep on hitting the wrong button here. You can see the aerial shot of Jericho with the wadi. He has gardens in the courtyards, but also across the wadi, this great sunken garden, and then also a giant pool here. And in fact, he has gardens in all of his palaces. He has several palaces around his kingdom, but then in several of them, he also has pools. And this is I'm just going to show you a couple of my favorite ones, because this one is at Caesarea Maritima, where his palace was they call it the promontory palace, jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea, and the pool is in this sort of like courtyard here on the promontory. And then my absolute favorite is Herodium, which is near Jerusalem, also near Bethlehem. If anybody has been there to visit, it's a magnificent site. It's actually this artificial mountain that he had built for his palace, which is kind of inside this mountain here. And at the foot of the mountain is a giant garden complex, which is very similar to the layout of the Petra Garden. It has a pool, the only one that I've ever been able to find with an island as well, and then to the north of it is the garden terrace, so that the garden is to the side of the pool, not around the pool. But this pool is 4 times the size of the one in Petra. The island itself is actually about the same dimensions, just around, as you can see. And he had his water for this garden transported from the pools of Solomon, which are over 5 kilometers away. So the kind of point that I want to make here is if you look at the actual history of the tradition of gardens in the ancient Near East, with fertility and abundance associated with paradise being associated with it, but also then the idea of the king, that it's the king's palace, and he puts himself into the position of being the gardener for his empire. So we can start to sort of think about what maybe the Nabatean king was doing. By the way, this would have been Aretas IV, which was brought up in the previous talk. So right at the very end of the 1st century BC, right at the end of Herod the Great's rule, towards the end of his rule, and also, as was said, that they were relatives. Herod the Great was part Nabatean. So there's this competition going on across the borders with palace building and, of course, monument building of any type, but then also with these gardens. But in this case, in this kind of environment, the emphasis is really on the water itself, the display of the water, this giant pool, the irrigated trees, and that is a statement in itself, that if you came to Petra, walked through the Sikh, and then walked down the main road, seeing this giant artificial oasis in the middle of this desert city, that anybody visiting would have been extremely impressed by this conspicuous consumption of water and known that the Nabateans were legitimate rulers, right? That they had their place, their kingdom in this region of the world at the time. So it was a kind of a political statement of their presence and their ability to control the environment, this desert environment, to make their city bloom. Thank you.